Hi, good afternoon everyone, and welcome to today's construction clinic hosted by the ICCP in partnership with our training partner Claims Class. We're delighted to welcome you back today. I can see a lot of familiar names creeping in each week, so you'll know the format by now, but just to go through a few housekeeping points. On your screen you have a control panel. Today's session will be taking your questions, so you just need to be aware of your question box here. Please feel free to send your questions in, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. May I also ask, if you are sending in a question, please send it through in one message rather than in a piecemeal message. It just helps me to field through them quicker, and we can get through more questions that way. We have had a few connectivity issues ourselves just leading up to the session today. So if you have any issues with audio or the webcams, please raise your hand. You'll see a little hand icon on your control panel there. I'll try to do my best to help. But as I said, I think with everybody around the world doing online webinars like this at the moment, bandwidth might be not on our side today. So we'll do our best, but the recording always has a smooth playback. So worst case scenario, the recording will be available later. Okay, so a quick introduction to the ICCP for those of you who haven't heard of us before. We are a professional members organisation, and we recognise professionals with skills, qualifications and expertise in the professional management of construction claims. We've got three main objectives, and those are to establish international professional standards for the management of claims, to give recognition to those who have gained the appropriate knowledge and experience in the management of claims, and also to help and educate those who would like to gain that experience. So on to membership. We have three main levels of membership: associate member and fellow. So entry to the institute at any of those levels would entitle you to use those designatory letters after your name. Each level comes with a certain set of requirements which must be met to gain entry. And today, just to freshen things up a bit for those of you that have been with us through the previous construction clinics, we're just going to dive into some of the details required for associate membership today. So you'll see that we've got two routes to membership, Route A and Route B. Route A, we ask for a recognised qualification in a construction industry subject, or currently studying to gain a recognised qualification in a construction industry subject. We ask for a minimum of 5 years experience working within the construction industry, and also a minimum of member level membership of an appropriate professional institute or institutes within the construction industry. So those would be the likes of the RICS, the CIOB, the Chartered Institution of Civil Engineering Surveyors, etc., etc. Route B, on the other hand, is a more experienced route. So the first two prerequisites are the same. So the recognised qualification in a construction industry subject or studying to gain that qualification, the 5 years experience. But if we come down to the last section here, if you don't have a member level membership of another professional institute, then you can come in through the experience route. And here we ask for a minimum of 5 years experience dealing with claims as part of your general job requirements, or 2 years where you spent a significant amount of your time dealing with claims in that job role. So those are the two routes for associate membership. Once you're in at that level, we encourage you to continue through CPD, keep building up your knowledge, your expertise to achieve the full member in time. So I hope that's useful information for anybody interested in considering membership. And if you'd like more information, please go to the ICCP website. The link is on your screen there, or you can contact me. I'm happy to take any questions or provide more details. Okay, so on to today's clinic, and I'd like to welcome Paul Gibbons, our president, and Lee Spall, one of our steering committee members. They'll be taking your questions today, and I believe Paul is going to lead things for us. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Nina. and welcome everybody. Thank you for joining this clinic, wherever you are in the world. I hope you're keeping safe. So as Nina says, this is a half-an-hour clinic on construction-related matters, which members have put questions to myself and other committee members. So the first one today is from David Kagwa. And David asks this question: if COVID-19 is a force majeure event and the employer is a government department and there was a change in law which had restricted movement, broken down the supply chain and restricted air travel of the contractor's experts, would a contractor be entitled to prolongation costs, profit and extension of time? And if so, what kind of documents can support such a claim in case the contractor has COVID-19 delays? And indeed, in that regard, what can his defence be for liquidated damages? So David, I'm not sure if you're aware of our clinic number 1, but we dealt with force majeure in quite a lot of detail, and particularly under FIDIC, where it is dealt with in accordance with clause 8.4 and 19.4. And indeed, you've got to be careful under FIDIC because not all force majeure would lead to an entitlement to costs with extensions of time. So you'd need to consider under which clause of FIDIC you'll be looking to claim under. If I turn to COVID-19 under the JCT, Standard Form of Contract here in the UK, again, be careful because COVID-19 force majeure would fall under a relevant event, but that relevant event might get you an extension of time, but it wouldn't necessarily get you a relevant matter. And it's the relevant matter that you actually need to claim loss and expense. So not necessarily if you put a notice in under JCT clause 2, you might not lead to the costs flowing for loss and expense. So again, under JCT, be very careful as to how you're claiming for force majeure, and indeed that you're claiming under the right banner. And if I turn now to NEC, NEC doesn't really have force majeure within it. However, the clause 60 and in particular clause 60.119, that deals with matters which are acts of prevention, if you wish. And indeed, it could be classed that the employer shutting the site down as a result of an act of prevention vis-a-vis force majeure, that could lead to a compensation event. And indeed, the compensation event under the NEC entitles one to claim for the time-related costs, and any other ancillary costs as a result of the COVID-19 impact. So I think the answer to your first part of the question, David, is it depends which contract you're working under. I've just mentioned 3 there, but there are a myriad of contracts around the world, and indeed, there are amendments to those standard forms. So I've just quoted standard forms. So look at your contract with regards to COVID-19. Turning now on to the documents which should be provided to support such a claim. I was actually involved with a webinar last week, and on that webinar we had the consultant's view, so our view. We had the view of a barrister and what records should be maintained from a barrister's perspective. We also had the view of an employer, so what records would an employer be expecting to receive? And indeed, we had the views of a contractor. So we had 4 independent views from the four parties to pretty much a contract, and in terms of what records should be maintained. And I think the general gist that I got from that webinar is that we are in uncharted waters. And I think it's on all of us to a contract to work collaboratively to maintain good contemporaneous records. And what does that actually mean? I think, in terms of how do you go about producing those good contemporaneous records? But I think it goes back to looking at what labour records are in place historically. Labour records that I've seen have been quite poor, and indeed it's the labour records that you're relying upon. I think you need to be very mindful of the fact that maintaining these records, you might not have the personnel on site to maintain these records. So for me, I would be suggesting that on live projects now, there needs to be a dedicated resource to maintaining those particular records. And those records would also flow into impacts on programme. So what allocation sheets have you maintained in terms of what did you plan to do, but also what have you not achieved in that particular day? And we need to record correctly and contemporaneously that the allocation of time, resources, plant. You may have scenarios where you've got designers and or other specialist consultants and indeed material suppliers who might not be able to get resources to projects. So I think you've got to be able to demonstrate exactly that you had these people engaged, ready to perform, and indeed they were not able to perform because they're either locked down in a specific country, or they couldn't get access to the site, or they couldn't get to where they needed to be. So I think, you know, there needs to be a recognition of that. We've then also got social distancing measures. So what we're finding is we're being asked by a lot of clients to reprogram their works. So an activity that might have taken a week, a few months ago, might well now take several weeks to complete because of the social distancing measures that are going to be enforced. And what does that mean to the completion date? Well, do you get an extension of time for that? Again, going back to, is it an effect of COVID-19? But it may well be that you're going to have situations where contractors are going to have to double shift, so work a day shift and a night shift and a weekend shift to make up lost time. But be careful, because you might need to be careful that you're not massaging inherent delays that were already other contractors making prior to the COVID-19 situation. I think it's very clear that you need to look at the records that are being maintained, where the project is at from a program perspective, and then draw a line in the sand and reschedule that. In terms of the lost productivity, I think it'd be a good idea to do a measured mile in terms of the productivity that you perhaps were achieving prior to COVID-19, and indeed the lack of productivity that you're now experiencing as a result of COVID-19. That's going to help quite well. I think the other thing is to bear in mind is updating your program. I would be suggesting, and indeed it was coming out last week, that the program needs to be updated at least weekly, but definitely monthly, in terms of all the impacts that are being felt. And that program needs to go across to the client, your client, in terms of demonstrating the delays that have been suffered and the causes of those delays. And again, with a collaborative hat on, working through a scenario. The one record that the barrister brought up in our discussions was obviously the issuing of timely notices. And again, we've done a previous seminar on notices, but the barrister was very clear on getting the notices issued on time and indeed correctly referencing the contract. Okay, so again, I think it's quite clear that we are in uncharted waters. But the single biggest issue we all maintain or face as the contracting industry is the demonstration of good records, and what does that look like. So I've just given you an idea there in terms of what those records might look like and how you might want to maintain them. So as I say, hopefully that's helped in that regard. Okay, moving on then to question number 2 from Akira Shiroa. Forgive me, Akira, if I've pronounced your surname incorrectly. But Akira asks the question, the DAB board has made a decision where the employer shall pay $8 million US to the contractor, but the employer did not pay that money to the contractor, expecting their win in arbitration. Meanwhile, the contractor had continuously claimed $8 million with financing charges in the interim payment statement until the arbitration. The employer finally won an arbitration after 3 years after the DAB's decision. In this case, does the contractor lose the right of the financing charges that he had before the arbitration, or does the contractor's right of receiving the financing charges remain? Well, my experience with the DAB board is that it is temporarily binding until such time as formal arbitration or litigation. And I would be suggesting in this scenario, a bit like here in the UK with adjudication, the decision of an interim position in terms of whether a matter had been temporarily won, I think that then gets overridden by the formation of the arbitrator's award. In this respect, I would be suggesting that the contractor's financing charges, in essence, get superseded by the award of the arbitration. So unfortunately, in my view, as I say, I don't believe that the financing charges would be claimable by, or indeed would be payable by the would be payable by the employer to the contractor. So hopefully that's answered your question, Akira. But if not, then please come back to us with some further clarification. And then another question for myself at the moment is from Sam Sharm. And Sam asked the question, the contract is a JCT Design and Build 2016, where there is an undefined provisional sum. And what weight in regards to allowance in the programme and or cost does this take into the actual works programme once the actual provisional sum is instructed? For example, does the instructed provisional sum offset the allowance made by the provisional sum in the contract? So quite simply, Sam, two methods. You've obviously got the undefined provisional sum, whereby there is no allowance within the programme for the cost implication or the programme effects of that provisional sum. It's just literally put into a contract so that one recognises that that work has yet to be fully defined and indeed programmed. So if it's undefined, it's there, it's to be considered, but in essence, in terms of making allowance in the programme and a cost assessment of that, that is undefined. If it was defined, then at the time of the contract being formed, you would be expected to make due allowance for the programme and cost effects of that defined provisional sum. But in this instance, as I believe there's an undefined provisional sum, you would literally wait for the employer or their agent to instruct the expenditure of that undefined provisional sum, and they will tell you as the contractor what to include for. You would then price that undefined provisional sum. That would then leave the contract. It will be replaced with the defined provisional sum element of it, and away you go under a variation order. So that hopefully, Sam, has answered your question around undefined and defined provisional sums. And on that note, I am quickly running through the stopwatch, so I will pass over to Lee. Thank you, Lee.
Thanks, Paul. Hello, everyone. I hope everyone's well. Thank you for the questions, and thanks for those of you signed online to join in. My first question is from George Castro, and he says, I'm acting as the engineer under a FIDIC yellow contract. It has 2 stages clearly identified. According to the contractual program, they should have finished and handed over the first stage before COVID-19 impacted our area, but they didn't. No reasons and or previous claims. Now, under the new scenario, they are working to 1/3 of the pace, and they've started to submit notices pleading, among others, force majeure. Beyond the specific clauses, FIDIC particulars, that the contract may or may not have regarding these issues, my question is whether the contractor has or do not have the right to issue any claim when all the problems have arisen due to his own delay only. Right, so the first part is the contractor hasn't submitted any claims. He's forecasting a delay to the project before COVID-19 impacted. That's my understanding of what you're saying, George. So the program's already late, then COVID comes along, and now he starts issuing notices. Well, it could be that he's implying that the previous delays before COVID-19, because he didn't issue any notices, are actually his delays, because now he knows how to issue a notice. So there's one good point that he's following the contract. Is he entitled to make a claim for COVID? Yes. If he can prove COVID has delayed his work, he is entitled, under the contract, depending on what your contract said, he is entitled to make that claim. He was going to be late. Now he's going to be even later because COVID-19's come. He can't be penalised for an event that's not his. It's definitely unforeseen. Say there was a public holiday, then it would be his issue because that public holiday was always coming. But for an event like COVID-19, he is entitled to make a claim if he believes he has a delay event, which is an excusable event. So yes, he can. As much as that may annoy you as the engineer, because he is late and he should have finished before, I understand the frustration. But under the contract, he should be entitled to make a claim. He's issued a notice. You need to review that notice and see whether it's valid. So he is entitled to make that claim. My next question is from Richard Kerr. Richard, you're going to have to get in touch with us on this question because I'm not sure I fully understand what you're asking. So I'm going to attempt to answer the question. And the question is, hi Lee, is it worth tracking float? If it's proved that one party has used the float, that party cannot then argue that the float would be the other party's responsibility, because the party that used the float subsequently took responsibility for the float. So we'll split this into two. First part, is it worth tracking float? If you have the manpower and you have the monitoring systems to track who uses the float, when they use it, then yeah, there's no bad record, but it's extremely onerous to monitor that float. If you bear in mind that a contractor may have started an activity and the engineer comes along and says, look, can you just come around and start this other area? How are you picking that up on the float issue? Because that activity then gets delayed and it eats the float. So unless you've got those specific records that on that day, the engineer requested on site verbally for you to start something else, and the supervisor on site went along with it and was willing to help and delayed that activity. But on your record, it shows that that your guys have just taken longer. So the float's beneath. So it's a really difficult one to try and track the float if that's how you mean to track it. Float being used up is just easy variances on every month. So the next part, and if it's proved that one party has used the float, that party can not then argue that the float would be the other party's responsibility, because the party that used the float subsequently took responsibility for the float. Now, this is where I'm slightly confused. So if it's proved that one party used the float, let's say the contractor used the float, and it becomes a critical activity, that party, the contractor, cannot then argue that that float would be the other party's responsibility, which would be the engineer's responsibility. Why would the contractor use the float and then say it's the other party's responsibility? I don't see how that scenario would work, and that's why I'm not too sure on the question, because it's the same the other way around. If the engineer used the float, he wouldn't say it's the contractor's responsibility, that float. So I'm not too clear on the question, Richard. I do apologize, but please, for clarification, contact Nina, and then we can deal with it on a one-on-one if I've not got the understanding of the question properly. Another question I have, and I do apologize because I will not be able to pronounce this name. I can say that it's Mr. De Wilder, but the first name, yeah, I'm not going to be able to pronounce that. I'm sure you'll understand. I did ask for a friend of mine who's South African for help on pronunciation, and I still can't get it. So that I don't offend, I'm not going to attempt to say that. It's just Mr. De Wilder. And I could well be saying that wrong as well, so I apologize on that. But the question is, an employer's delay event happened and the contractor has submitted his detailed claim for this event, defending his entitlement for an extension of time and additional costs associated. Awaiting the determination on this claim, so after the employer's delay occurred, some contractors' delays occurred with also an impact on the original date of completion, but far less than the impact of the employer's delay on the date of completion. Will the contractor lose part of the additional time claimed, prolongation costs claimed due to his own delay? My quick answer to that would be no. And my reasoning for that no is just, and I'm conscious of the time, let's say The employer's delay occurred on the 1st of January to the 20th of January, so there's a 20-day delay. The job was due to finish 1st of June. So now we're looking at 20th of June, and that's the EUT claim that we put together, 20 days delay. And we submitted that on the 1st of February, so 1 month after the claim, after the first event occurred. 1st of March, a month later, we're still waiting for the response, which is, it's said in the question that while we're waiting for the response, so 1 month after we submitted, we're waiting for the response. And between the 20th and the 25th of Feb, there's a 5-day delay due to our own reason. So that would impact the original completion if the employer delay had not occurred. We would have impacted the date from the 1st of June to the 5th of June. However, the critical path at the point of our event is the employer event, which delays the project to the 20th of June. Our event is after and doesn't affect the project completion. It is still not on the critical path. Therefore, you are entitled to the time and any of the prolongation costs that you've worked out. I'm not going to deal with costs, but you are entitled to that EUT that you've claimed for based on the first event was the 20 days, and that would have revised the completion date. And any works that finish before that date are not critical. Now, concurrency, one's in January and one's in February. They're different periods of time, so we won't even get into the concurrency argument. I hope I've answered that. Again, any questions you feel, or any of the other panelists that you talk to, and you feel that there's something we've missed on your question, contact us, and then we'll get back to you. I hope I've covered that. I do have one more question, but I think my time is out. So Nina, I'll pass back to you.
Thanks, Lee. Yeah, we're a minute from the 1/2 mark, and I'm conscious that we also started a couple minutes later today. So, and we have actually received one question through from somebody. So I think we'll take this question and then we'll wrap things up for today. This comes from Sat Gunarajar. Hope I've said that right. And bear with me a bit because it's a little bit long. In a project with a bespoke contract and the clause extension of the intended completion date states that the project manager shall extend the intended completion date if a compensation event occurs or a variation is issued which makes it impossible for completion to be achieved by the intended completion date without the contractor taking steps to accelerate the remaining work, which would cause the contractor to incur additional cost. But the clause under compensation events does not include an event relating to outbreak of an epidemic or pandemic. Sorry, everybody, I just had a pop-up on my screen there, which I had to get rid of. Sorry, I'm just actually scrolling down. I didn't realise how long the question actually was, so I think we will actually cut it there. Sat Gunarajar, I'm sorry to cut that short, but we'll get an answer for you offline rather than leave you hanging. But I don't think we've got time to go into that level of detail today.
So on that, Nina, just on that, if it is a genuine compensation event under a bespoke NEC, then there will be an active prevention clause within the NEC that SAT could place reliance on, and that's what they need to link it back to. So as Nina says, SAT, please bring that into the arena again and we'll have a look at that in more detail. Thank you, Nina. Sorry.
No, thanks, Paul. Okay, so that's it for today's clinic. Thank you to everybody for joining. I hope you found those answers useful. Thanks as always to Paul and Lee. We'll be back same time next week with 2 different presenters. The registration link and the details will be going out in the follow-up email later this afternoon. And as usual, the recordings for this session and all past sessions are up on the ICCP website under the webinars page, which is accessible from the homepage. So thanks to everybody, and hopefully we'll see you again next week.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye now.
See you. Bye. Bye.